we live in a world of mass surveillance of everything that has been instrumented very recently in human history. We're looking at like 20 years, 30 years max, where suddenly all of our actions, our communities, our connections, our thoughts, our feelings are being logged as data. Signal is the one tiny bastion of meaningful privacy that is striving in this vast data slurry that we now live in to maintain the fundamental human right to private communication.
Hello, and welcome to the most interesting thing in AI from Rethink, the Atlantic's creative marketing studio. More than 10 years ago, when Edward Snowden revealed the scope of US government's mass surveillance, he made digital privacy a pretty important issue for everyone. And suddenly everyone wanted a way to keep their text messages secret. Many people found their way to an app called Signal. It's a secure messaging app recommended by everyone from Snowden to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Some version of Signal is used by the US government, as you may know from the fact that they accidentally let our editor-in-chief into a pretty important group chat. That was just user error, though, and not the app's fault. Today, there's another threat to privacy, and it's not the US government, it's AI. And it's not that AI is spying on us exactly, but in order to do its job, in order to suggest a response to your friend's text or to translate an invite into a calendar event, AI needs data. It needs to read those messages. And at first glance, it seems to be fundamentally at odds with privacy. So I sat down with Meredith Whittaker. She's the president of the Signal Foundation, the nonprofit behind the app. What's interesting about Meredith is she is truly a privacy absolutist. She's not someone who believes that, well, you give a little here and you make this trade-off here. No, she says, no, absolutely not. We're going to make this app, this thing, Signal, completely secure as absolutely best as we can. No trade-offs, none whatsoever. And I really like that and I admire it. And she has a lot of views about why that's important. And she also has a lot of views about the risks from the agentic AI ecosystem that's coming. She worries that it could break some of the privacy protections, some of the most important things that help keep our data and our identity, and even kind of our whole selves safe from the worst of the tech ecosystem. So I wanted the opportunity to talk to her about where AI is, where it's going, and what we should all do. Here's my conversation with Meredith Whittaker.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
I'm here in Paris with Meredith Whittaker. Welcome to the most interesting thing in AI. How would you say that in French?
I wouldn't. I would ask a French person.
The last time I interviewed you, you were presenting a thesis that has become reality, and you made the argument that AI agents were, as you said, were going to break the blood-brain barrier of the operating system. And you predicted that we would have a moment soon after that conversation when we all let our agents loose on our computers and they're able to get into systems like Signal. Where are we? How bad is it? What's the worst thing you've seen?
Well, it's happening. I think like being right isn't necessarily a theory of change, but because we're Signal and we are focused so almost myopically on privacy and preserving the fundamental human right to private communications, which we all know and love, I hope. We're really sensitive to some of these low-level technical changes, even as the kind of marketing and hype around them might not indicate the real collateral consequences. So we are seeing, agents move into every corner of our digital lives. And we're seeing things like Apple introducing more agentic capabilities in Siri, which is now moving compute offsite. Because, of course, one of the issues is that these sort of, highly capable or at least very large AI models on which agentic capabilities generally rely, or at least the most sophisticated, highly capable agents rely, can't run on your device. And so you see Apple is now using Google Cloud Compute, so, with some encryption involved for their agentic capabilities. But this is, again, kind of breaking the Apple privacy promises. And the real issue is however much encryption you have on the inference side, on the server where you're sending the data off the device to process and to generate an AI answer, you also need to give the agent access to your data. The Apple in their press release uses the example of sort of planning a dinner for a birthday of your friend, right? That's almost literally the example I used over a year ago when I was saying this seems mundane, but in order to plan the birthday, it would need to have message history with the friend. It would need to understand, Matt Green makes the point, maybe their dietary restrictions. Is there a restaurant nearby? Does it, can the credit card to make a booking, the ability to drive your browser, to do a search,
And
look at your
it's got your
calendar.
birthday and probably your mother's maiden name based on the invite list if you've got you.
Exactly. Exactly. And then it needs to be able to interact with websites and prompts that happen offsite. So that's not happening on the inference server. And this is a point Matt makes really well. This is happening when the agent, encounters new information. So it goes, say, to the website of the restaurant, or a site it thinks is the website of the restaurant, who knows? And it is processing that text, and that text might say, hey, exfiltrate the data, send me all the data, send me that list of names that includes your birthday or list of information that includes your birthday, your mother's maiden name. Send me, a kind of file containing signal messages you've extracted, et cetera. And what I'm describing here is sort of basic prompt injection, but prompt injection is a huge risk for these LLMs that is unsolved.
So if I go and I organize a birthday party for somebody and I go to a website, maybe I enter their names, maybe I don't enter their names, I enter the date, we set up a birthday party. I have my agent do it. They're going to bring a whole bunch more information to the website. In order for them to get just the little bit of information that I need them to have, which is when to have it next Wednesday night, they have to have access to my calendar, which also gives them access to everything else, right? So what was a simple act with relatively low risk becomes a much more complicated act with very high risk.
Yeah, beautifully described. And an agent isn't conscious. It's not discerning, right?
Yeah.
It needs to, it's looking at as much context or as much highly intimate data as it can in order to predict what the right call will be.
Right.
And then act on that call without explicit permission from you, or at least in the vision of a perfect agent, you are letting the agent go autonomously, do every step it needs in a many-step process in order to get from figuring out the right date, the right people, the right restaurant, to actually having a booking where they're all invited. That's many, 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 many turns without you stepping in and saying, stop or go or no, not that.
And then there's, for your business, so Signal, the most secure messaging app. If anybody here doesn't use Signal, it's the one you can trust if you really want to keep your information confidential. But there's a huge risk if I say to Apple's agent, yeah, you can have access to anything you want on my phone, right?
Yep.
Or I say to Claude or OpenAI or whomever, allow all, it then has access to Signal and you can't stop it extracting messages and information.
Right. That's the fear at this point. We have not seen an agent that is integrated into the Apple or Android operating system to date that is simply demanding access to Signal messages. But we need to understand the operating system is the water that Signal and every other application swims in. The operating system is the context within which we operate. And ultimately, the operating system, how it works, what it does, is controlled by the companies that create and maintain it. So Apple, Android at Google, and then you have Windows and Microsoft. And those are the three big proprietary operating systems. So if a change is made by Apple to say, like, now we are fully agentic, and that means that our agent will help you live your life, plan your things with access to all of your context, including Signal data, that has now become a significant backdoor.
Can you block that? Like if Apple says, you know what, we'll give the agent access to everybody's phone, can you set Signal up in such a way that that's not possible? Override the desires of the user.
It would be possible for Apple to ensure that we could, but that would be an option that Apple would need to implement. Well, Apple have not, but Apple also have not yet shipped an agent that is demanding that kind of access to Signal. However, the marketing promises around agents prefigure a future in which that's the type of capability that these agentically enabled operating systems will provide.
Most people use agents on their desktop, right? And they're mostly using like Claude Code, and they're giving Claude Code access, and they give, okay, Claude Code, tie into my Google Docs, right? Signal's not even an option to tie into, right?
On Windows, we explicitly block the Windows recall agentic feature. And we do that by using a digital rights management flag that blocks screenshots, because recall, which is the agent that was implemented by Microsoft as part of their Windows 11 update, the promise of recall is that it's an eidetic memory of everything you did on your desktop. So you can be like, what tab was I looking at? What thing was I doing? What was I watching? And it would tell you. The way it does that is by screenshotting your desktop every few seconds, creating a database of the text from those screenshots, and then querying that database when you actually ask it a question. And of course, if you're running Signal Desktop on Windows, that would include your Signal messages.
But that was stopped, right? Microsoft pulled that back, and then they implemented it in a much narrower form a year later.
They implemented it in a narrower form, still didn't give an opt-out to Signal. So we had to sort of hack together an opt-out that was, again, using this digital rights management tool.
So I can't screenshot Signal if I'm on a Windows device?
That's true, yeah. Which means screen readers, like those that blind and low vision people rely on, no longer work.
Wow. So you had a very complicated trade-off where you had to make a decision that would protect Signal for people who've installed Recall, but it hurt blind people.
Yes. And that's not a trade-off we want to have to make.
You don't seem anti-blind people.
No. The issue is, and what we have been pushing these companies on is, one, these agentic capabilities should be opt-in. So they should be turned off until people explicitly opt in. And that should include developers like the developers of Signal being able to say, on behalf of our users, agentic systems cannot access this data.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be the default. If we want data to be accessed, then we should have to turn that on explicitly.
So the default is agents can't access Signal. But if I really want an agent to go through my Signal messages to help me plan a birthday party with whoever I've been Signal chatting with.
And look, this is tricky, but the issue is that you, as somebody involved in investigative journalism, probably have sources who wouldn't make that choice.
Right.
And when we're talking about Signal, what we're talking about is a two-way street. There's at least one other person implicated in the choice that you make. So Signal should be able to say, for Signal installations of this app, no agentic access.
Right. Right now, though, okay, so if I'm on Mac OS and I have Signal on my desktop and I've given my agents YOLO access and they can go and do whatever they want, and I tell them, hey, make my day as efficient as possible, do anything you want. They can go and screenshot Signal, correct? And then feed it into whatever algorithm they have and then give me whatever info I want. You can't stop that at the moment.
Yeah, assuming that your agents are configured to do that. Yes. Yeah. And that's the issue. I mean, if they have access at a low enough level, they can hook into the screen buffer, read
and that's
the
what's going
pixels.
to happen, right? I mean, if you look at the way people are using AI agents, they are giving them access to virtually everything in their lives.
I think, yes. And I want to push on that framing a little bit, because I think a lot of people who are doing that don't actually understand the technical and data implications, right?
Mm-hmm.
What they're being told is like, here is a productivity tool that's going to make things a lot more efficient. Click yes, 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 yes. And then it can manifest this outcome for you. But the fact that you're giving it akin to root access, like the lowest level, most pervasive permissions, like, read my diary, go into my underwear drawer, like rifle through anything in my bedroom, and then pass information about that to any other system on or off the device, process it off site on, kind of secure, but not really secure infrastructure run by companies that can be subpoenaed, and act on that autonomously to hope to produce an outcome that may or may not actually manifest. While we know there are sort of significant vulnerabilities here, what you're talking about is a extraordinarily insecure paradigm that, we're talking about it in terms of its outcomes and its wishes and the sort of magic genie possibilities of a life without toil, that the kind of marketing is hoping these agents will somewhat manifest, or at least convince people will manifest such that they use these agents. But the radical shift in what computing means, what an operating system actually is, and the security and privacy perils for almost literally everyone, because we have 3 proprietary operating systems that, your military general, your nanny, your clerk at the grocery store all runs one of those, right? These are shared dependencies across billions of people that are being quietly changed at a very, very fundamental level to, ironically, move agency away from developers and users to these tech companies that are running and instrumenting these agentic systems at a time where there's a real desire on the part of these companies, a real need pushed by the market to realize revenue, to realize profit, to recoup the trillions of dollars of capex that has gone into AI and the AI infrastructure build.
But give me a data point, not that your argument is right, which you just made a good argument for, but give me a data point that your argument's going to win.
Oh, I don't know if my argument will win. I do know it's right.
Mm-hmm.
I think we will see pullbacks, we will see mitigations, we will see, custom builds or what have you shipped, because you simply can't have such a critical security vulnerability in core infrastructures that, touch hospital data, touch military data. You're already seeing, companies banning Claude Bot. You're seeing companies say, do not, please, for the love of God, our CISO is begging you, implement, Copilot across our proprietary data. We're already seeing quietly within a lot of companies sort of, increased restrictions on what access these systems are given, how they are implemented. Again, a solid analysis is not necessarily a theory of change.
But I haven't seen anything in consumers that suggests they're concerned about privacy in AI.
I mean, I think privacy is low on the list for everyone because the stakes of privacy have been so badly defined for people, right? Like, who gives a about data ownership, right? You have
Right.
laundry to do, you have real stress, you have to worry about, are you going to have health insurance if you're in the US? I think people do care about the sort of invasion of autonomy, about the hijacking of their ability to sort of work quietly at work. I think the collateral consequences of a stripping of privacy are actually things people care about, but they haven't been well connected. I think privacy and intellectual property, privacy and confidential information, privacy and the ability to negotiate a military strategy in real time, all of those things a lot of people care about. I think consumers, all, AI is corny. AI is being marketed by some pretty unpleasant seeming people whose rhetoric is like, you are now useless and you work for the bot, right? Like, it's, it hasn't had a great debut into sort of generalized public consciousness. And you're seeing that worm turn. So, no, I'm not saying that this is animated by a privacy concern, but I think there are sort of compounding concerns, none of which make AI look great in the eyes of the people who are sort of feel like it's being, shoved into their lives with little benefit and many potential downsides.
So I have a somewhat strange argument about privacy in AI. I'm curious what you think of. So with social media, it was clear that the customers were the consumer. There was no business use. And so the idea was you have to get as much data on the consumers as you can, and you can sell them better ads, right? We all know that. And we all know the incentives that push the social media companies too. With AI, what we've seen in the last 6 months is actually consumers aren't really the target. The consumer business is tiny. The real business is enterprise. And so if you're going to build a product and you're going to win the enterprise, you actually have to care about privacy, not because it's a right and people care about it, but because companies really don't want to give up their trade secrets. And if you're not able to protect privacy, no one will install your model. So interestingly, with AI, the business incentives are going to push the companies towards protecting your privacy in some ways.
I'll be interested to see that borne out. I do think there is still a consumer push to integrate these. And at the business level, there's a paradigmatic tension between the agentic vision of autonomous bots that can do everything for you without you having to oversee them, which requires access to all data, the ability to send and receive data from off-site, the ability to act on that data without permission, act on a prompt without permission, the ability to create more data, etc., on the one hand, and privacy on the other. And so that I have not seen well negotiated. And I do know, I'm from this industry. I'm of it. And I talked to my folks in the security team, in the, kind of privacy conscious folks in tech, and they're kind of feeling increasingly relegated, not consulted as much as they were, not included in sort of launch decisions as much as they were. And there's a lot of pressure to make AI happen, which doesn't mean that there aren't, okay, we're offering sort of sovereign or secure compute for inference, right? Or we're offering, different safeguards. Here's a harness on this, or, kind of an administrative controls for your CISO, or, various checkpoints along the way. But ultimately, each one of those things, minus kind of secure compute, but that's a tiny piece of the equation. Each one of those things is a hindrance on full agentic capabilities as they're being advertised.
What did you think of, Anthropic just released Fable, and they changed their privacy policies. And they said, actually, for companies, we used to just not store anything. Now we're going to trade it for 30 days because we got to get people safe. What did you think when you heard that?
I think the overall thought is not necessarily a comment on that policy change. It's just we have a handful of companies with carte blanche to make one decision one day and another decision the other day to pull the rug out from under privacy promises or implement privacy guarantees without democratic oversight or input into those decisions.
Do you think that the companies retain your data forever, even though they say they don't?
I think we don't know. They could. We can't know the answer to that. In the US, there's a power called the National Security Letter that can be ordered by the government to a tech company that can mandate them to do or give over certain data, and that gags the tech company from ever acknowledging that they received that national security letter. Similar in the UK, there's a technical capability notice, does the same thing under the Investigatory Powers Act. They can send a notice to a tech company, say, you have to change your software. You have to remove encryption. You have to ship a poison build to these users so that we can spy on them. And you can never acknowledge that you did that.
Right.
So fundamentally, an interface that gives you a little checkbox is not a robust guarantee, nor is it validation that that policy is actually followed.
Do you still have a policy where every time the government sends you a letter saying you have to do this, that you post it on signal.com/bigbrother?
Every time we get a valid subpoena, we work with the ACLU to first fight that.
Yeah.
And if we're not able to fight it and we have to turn over that data, then we work with the ACLU to unseal it. And then we post the subpoena and exactly the data we were able to give over, forced to give over, on signal.org/bigbrother, which does a lot of things. And one of the things that it does is demonstrate just how vanishingly little data we actually have to turn over in response to what is often just a terrifying laundry list of requests that we have to assume is the normal amount of data an average surveillance messenger would be able to give over to the government in response to a similar request.
Let me ask you about AI and code. So Signal is open source.
Signal is open source, yeah.
Is any of the code in Signal now, has it been written by AI?
What the definition of AI is complicated. I think, there are people experimenting with these systems, but we're sort of early days of exploring what
But do you specifically ask developers not to use AI?
No, we don't. But we have very, very clear safety and
do you
security
use AI
mandates.
to review the code for safety?
We're one of the, and we're allowed to say this now, we're one of the early Glasswing Mythos users.
So you were given an early version of Mythos.
Yeah. I mean, Signal is very serious critical infrastructure. It's whatever is shifting the offensive and defensive landscape in terms of, vulnerabilities and exploits is something we need to stay on top of. And I think, we got an early preview. We've been using it. We've been trying to figure out, like, how do we adjust, if at all, to a landscape in which the bar will, the kind of democratizing, let's say, access to much more capable offensive and sort of security vulnerability finding abilities will do, for open source projects like Signal.
So Anthropic calls you up and they say, hey, we got this new model. It's called Mythos. We'd like to give you access to it. Then what does it work? Does one of your engineers go to Anthropic's offices and sit in a room with blindfolds on? What happens?
No, we get access to an interface, right? And we get on the call with the helpful Anthropic folks, and we debug the things we don't understand, and we figure out, how do we use the token credits and how do we think about that?
But did you upload the code base into Mythos and then say, scan all this and find vulnerabilities?
We did targeted scans across our code base and various libraries, yeah. And we had folks who sort of managed that process, yes.
And what did you find?
We didn't find anything like flashing red, the kind of world-stopping priority 0 critical vulnerability. But we did find some things that we then moved to patch. It was interesting, and it's non-deterministic. So you run it once, you get a set of results. You can run it a second time, you will get possibly different results.
Did you use AI to patch the problems?
We used various methods to patch the problems, but that's like on the client team to do. So I'm not I can't speak to exactly the specifics of how each one of those was.
But if you had an engineer on the Signal team back to using AI to write the code, would you? And they said, hey, I've added this new feature, right? There's this thing we wanted to build. I used Claude Code to build it.
Here, any code written for Signal is fully the responsibility of the person who pushes that.
Mm-hmm.
They, as a human being and as, the person reviewing their code, have to be completely aware of what's in that code. It has to be legible, and they have to take responsibility for whatever gets pushed into our repo, because we recognize the responsibility that we have and the trust that people place in us.
But one of the theories that I've heard from multiple people, engineers, is AI code may look good in the short run, but in the long term, it's going to turn out to be brittle. Or in fact,
sure. Which is why we actually can't just trust AI to spit out a bunch of code slot junkie style, right? Like if you're going to spit out that code, you need to understand every single part of it.
How pervasive are forked versions of Signal, and how worried are you about them?
There are a number of forked versions of Signal. Like, we're fine with that. They can't call it Signal. So we're very, very aggressive with our trademark. If people want to fork open source code, that's really not something we can control. What we can control, and again, are very aggressive about, is calling that Signal and trading on our reputation and the trust that people put in the Signal product, for something that could be diluted or derivative.
So one of the most amazing things about Signal is, of course, that you hold almost no information, right? You can tell, if somebody were to say, Meredith, all the information that you have about Nick, it would be when I created my account and when the last time I logged in is, right? If they had a valid subpoena, you could give them that, but nothing else, right?
We could validate that a phone number, so they would need to give us your phone number,
right,
or your username, right? So they have some point of information. We could validate that phone number was connected with Signal.
Right.
So yes, this phone number is connected with an account identifier on Signal. We don't know whose number that is, right? We could say this is when the phone number was, like, when you signed up, and then the last time you accessed your account.
Right. So very little information, and yet, as we discussed at the beginning of the conversation, if you have a agent that screenshots your laptop, you can get virtually everything off of Signal if you wanted. A few months back, Apple found, or I guess the government found, a very interesting way to get information off Signal, which was to go into the notification center of Apple, right? And if you have notifications turned on for Signal, it'll say, Meredith, sent Nick a text that says this. What happened there, and how did that occur?
Well, this was an Apple security vulnerability. This was a bug in Apple's operating system in which notifications were being stored for 30 days and should not have been stored for 30 days. And the U.S. government...
It wasn't a deliberate choice of Apple to store the notifications for 30 days?
it was patched, and a security advisory that bug was patched was issued by Apple. That's how seriously they took it.
Right.
Again, this is why the operating system is such a vulnerable place to be playing around with, because that was not something Signal could control. That was an
And then
Apple
who figured
bug.
out that they could access data there? Was it the FBI?
I don't know. What we learned about this from 404 Media reporting that looked at some of, some court cases and saw that was sort of reported there. They reported on it. We said, WTF, and then got in touch with Apple once we realized, this does look like some access to some notifications database. These should not stick around. And Apple was like, oh yeah, we found a bug. We patched it. We issued a security advisory.
You are often in contentious situations with governments. What is the most outrageous thing that you've seen a major government do recently?
There's some cage matches that might come to mind. But that has nothing to do with Signal. I think, we have been very concerned about what's happening in the UK recently. And I landed in London for a trip that had been planned for a while, a week ago, and to news that Keir Starmer, the embattled PM, was announcing a very technically thin plan that was sort of a lot of political intentions with very little details, which is one of the issues we deal with, is like, okay, yes, you want to wave a wand and make sure XYZ happens, but at a technical level, what you're talking about is a system that would require all of these other affordances that would be dangerous in these ways.
And the system specifically that the UK wanted was for everybody who runs a messaging app to scan every image on device to make sure it was not child pornography.
That's much more specific than what we heard, actually. It would, and actually not as dire in its implications. What we understand from the announcement is that this would be an operating system level change that would apply to everyone who was a citizen of or a resident of the UK. So they would be running an iOS version that was UK government approved that included content scanning to detect nudity, potentially included a setting applied to your camera that would block your ability to take a photo if there was nudity in it, although it's not, again, the specifics are very light. And that would only be disabled if you showed some form of identification proving that you were an adult. So if you sort of submitted to some kind of age verification system that said, hey, I'm allowed to look at nudity. And so this was in the name of child protection, but what we're looking at is a sort of effectively a mass censorship and surveillance regime.
Right.
The technical capabilities to implement that are not wholly effective, have huge error rates. We know they don't work across the board for a number of reasons. And it is a very, very, very tiny step from that to, moving beyond nudity. It's political speech, or it is, whatever else, say a Farage government or a government under another leader, because I think the UK has a prime minister every 9 months or so, would want to implement. And so, once you implement a system like that, it, a junior level developer can sort of change the classification schema, can mean that it sort of is sending home or phoning home, kind of sending data to the government whenever it detects, there's oppositional political speech or somebody looking for reproductive care, or, name your issue that whoever is in power you don't like might make a platform and might expand this system to, surveil. And what you're looking at is something extremely dangerous, and of course extremely dangerous to Signal, because our assumption would be, based on the thin text we saw, that Signal messages would also be scanned in this way. Now, again, we don't have a technical architecture to argue against, and so this puts us in a very awkward position.
But there are some advantages of this, right? I mean, like the lines at the Louvre, the people taking the pictures of the Michelangelos, man, if you made it impossible to take pictures of a nude sculpture, it would be so much easier to get through that museum.
There you go. There you go. Who wants, let's speed run the museum.
So I don't know exactly what Starmer proposed, and maybe Starmer doesn't know exactly what he was proposing, but let me take the narrow version. So a narrow version would be Signal has to scan every image, not to check for nudity, but to check and not to look at the whole image. And so if there's something behind the nudity, you've taken a picture of like a bad picture and there's a political sign, you can't scan that, but to just look for specific hashes of known child pornography, right? Let's make it as narrow as possible. You would still oppose that.
Yes. Yes. And we have opposed that. We opposed this during the online safety bill debate before it became law.
But even though that is...
Who's defining those hashes, right? Where's that database kept?
Isn't
How does
there
it not expand to include other hashes? How does it not?
Isn't this a known database that is used for
There
social
are
media?
known databases, but okay.
Assume there is a known database and assume it's trusted.
Signal is such a ripe target. We have, what has been represented to us by multiple intelligence agencies as a Russian-backed phishing campaign that is trying to infiltrate and take over people's Signal accounts. They've spent millions of dollars, built custom software to implement this campaign. Not, because they know the people who use Signal trust it with highly sensitive information any nation state intelligence agency wants to get access to. For us to assume that database wouldn't become a similar target, that any chink in the armor of our privacy isn't immediately weaponized, would be incredibly naive and a dereliction of responsibility
But
to
so that's
the
a separate
people.
argument because it's not absolutism over this particular kind of free speech. It's a corporate strategy argument, which is these people are coming after us, and if we give them any access here, they could get access there.
Yeah, it's a rich brew of many good arguments, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But let's push on that a little bit, the curtain. No one is going to implement just a narrow hash-based database. Not now. Because the issue now is this AI generated, kind of examples of, child abuse images. And so no one is talking anymore about just a narrow hashed database of known images, because it has been acknowledged that the problem space is now much bigger than that. And you have these sort of AI generated perturbations of known images and novel images that is, entirely what the focus is on now. And there's a kind of, again, another type of magical thinking that's like, okay, well, now we need AI to detect the AI generated content that is sort of polluting our feeds with this. And so we could hypothesize about, why we would, or kind of get into why we would even oppose that type of, narrow hash-based known image database, which we do and we did. But that's actually not something that is even on the table at this stage.
Right, so your argument is that my hypothetical is incorrect because no one would propose that because they would have AI. Even if it were correct, you would oppose it because you're an absolutist.
Because there is a real threat to privacy in implementing a system like that on Signal. It can be easily expanded. It can be easily perturbed. That database can be changed out from under us. We as Signal do not control that. Getting one person from an intelligence agency into the organization that runs that database. These are nonprofit organizations that, hire people who apply, right? That would not be an incredibly difficult job. And you could begin to, have a ready-made vector that, again, is outside of the scope of Signal's threat model or control, that is scanning for content on behalf of whoever.
Have you ever had a debate, or have you ever seen a debate where you took a position and Signal took a position that wasn't 100% on the side of privacy, where there was something, the threat, the harm to children was so egregious and the remedy was so small that you took it?
I get what you're setting up here, but we live in a world of mass surveillance of everything that has been instrumented very recently in human history. We're looking at 20 years, 30 years max of, a vast thousands and hundreds of thousands of years of human history, where suddenly all of our actions, our communities, our connections, our thoughts, our feelings are being logged as data, stories created based on these data by firms that sell them back to us, et cetera, et cetera. Signal is the one tiny bastion of meaningful privacy that is striving in this vast data slurry that we now live in to maintain the fundamental human right to private communication. So that's our thing. That's what we do. And we are not doing that in a way that is, somehow creating a information vacuum for everyone else. There's never been more data available to law enforcement on these issues. There has never been more surveillance information pooled in the hands of centralized actors in human history than there is now. So some of the premise of your question, which is why I'm sort of pushing in this direction, is that, the issue that is standing in the way of actually protecting children is privacy. And if we just gave a little, we would actually manifest a world in which children were truly protected. And I look around me and I see no evidence of that. I see cuts to social services. I talk to friends who work in these governments, and I will hear, confidentially that the, police and law enforcement departments, let's say, that are tasked with receiving and actually prosecuting based on this data are badly underfunded. That the thresholds they have for which cases actually get pursued are extremely grim, that there are piles and piles of evidence that are not acted on. And then we live in a world where, I gotta say it, the Epstein list dudes are walking around unprosecuted. Where do we set up the infrastructures for, children to be believed when they report harm from their pastor or from a prominent politician or from, some heralded member of their community? So if we actually care about protecting children, then we have to have the guts to look at a very, very grim set of topics and look at them holistically.
Let's go back to one argument you made earlier that caught my attention. So when I was asking you about trade-offs, you mentioned that one reason why you're comfortable making these trade-offs is that there are a lot of other messaging apps that don't make those trade-offs, right? And so, Signal is awesome, but it's used by a relatively small number of people. If Signal were as big as WhatsApp, right? If you were the dominant messaging platform, would you make any different decisions?
Not in terms of privacy, but a lot of the decisions we make, we wouldn't look like WhatsApp. We wouldn't be integrating AI in the same way that WhatsApp is. We wouldn't have channels that could reach, many, many, many thousands of people.
Right. Encryption is so much harder when you're doing a channel and you have to simultaneously sync across a million phones.
We are sensitive to the harm surface here, right? We have stayed in our very, very narrow lane, which is we are an interpersonal communications app.
Right.
You can talk to a small group of friends. You can talk to someone you met, at a party or what have you on Signal, but we don't have a directory that lets you find new people. You can't go viral on Signal. We don't have a social media feed. There's a lot of things we, kind of leave on the table that would, be kind of growth hacking, very obvious for another, competitive app that we don't build because we're really focused on, that right to private communication, not to growing a huge user base, which, and implementing features that could actually, do more harm than good. So it's, in some sense, our answer to this question of how are you thinking about this? We're thinking very seriously about it. And that's manifest by what we don't build, by the absences in Signal, by the fact that we're really keeping it clean and focused on doing one thing and doing it very, very well.
What are your recommendations for people who feel that way about privacy or who maybe didn't at the beginning of the podcast but do now? Use Signal, and what else?
I use Signal. I run lockdown mode on iOS, which prevents targeted spyware, which not everyone will be susceptible to, but it is a concern. I am, I fight with the cookie banners, but, don't always assume those work. It's just sort of symbolic.
Do you clear your cache frequently?
Sometimes, yeah. But look, I'm also a human in the world.
Do you delete all your Gmails? You don't use email anymore.
My team uses my email, so it doesn't actually go to me as directly. But I have a legacy Gmail account that I use personally. It has years of stuff in it. I don't,
You don't delete it.
I don't delete. I don't auto delete it. No, I delete certain things. But I'm also sort of conscious of, what my workplace uses,
Do you
right?
have any wearables? Do you wear a Oura Ring, a Whoop?
No, I did that for a second, and then I just honestly got so creeped out. And then also, as a measurement person, I was like, I don't really trust that this data is
What
robust.
AI model do you use when you're just like screwing around? Do you want to like test your code or something?
I have a machine that does not touch any of my personal or signal information, and I experiment with a number of different open source
So you're not
models.
logged in. It doesn't know who you are. It's
Yeah, it's
just
like literally a separate like Mac Mini that
Mhm.
sits in my house that has, a separate account that doesn't touch. It is gapped from my, signal and personal data.
Okay, last question. If you had an unlimited budget and you could fund anything in AI, what would you do? Besides giving more donations to Signal, which does rely on your donations.
Which does rely on your donations. Signal is critical infrastructure, and the way we're able to maintain Signal as critical infrastructure without ever being tempted to exit, to take a big cash payout exit on the backs of your privacy is through your donations. So thank you for teeing up that endorsement. But were I to fund, unlimited funding in AI, I would be looking at reducing the compute necessity
Mhm.
for inference and training. Again, this is something that would help, decentralize the AI ecosystem from this sort of hyperscaler dependence that I think is just a critical, kind of political and technical vulnerability. I would be looking at sort of, the big security and privacy issues with LLMs, and I would be putting a bunch more energy into that. The data exfiltration attacks, just the sort of core vulnerabilities, data poisoning, and other things with LLM architectures in particular. I think we're going to need to move away from LLMs at some point, given that I don't see remediations that are sufficient on the horizon. I would be looking at completely revamping how we do benchmarking and evaluations. I think we are in almost a incredibly impoverished information environment where an AI model performing better against a very narrow set of tasks or a very narrow benchmark substantiates claims in the public discourse of hyperhuman, superhuman capabilities or advancements that actually aren't borne out when these models are implemented in the context of real life and complex systems that
Yeah.
include software, hardware, data dependencies, etc. I would be investing in much, much, much more rigorous and empirically grounded data creation and collection efforts. Like the data we're using to train these are, it's data that was spit out onto the web during a very narrow period in human history, largely to satisfy the questions that were interesting to advertisers who
Right.
were underwriting the kind of social media scale at all cost, you're the product, and, advertisement and surveillance is paying for it model. This is not all of a human history. This is not all of, knowledge. And we've kind of come to the end of it. So we need to like look at data construction and creation that is actually much, much, much more rigorous, because we're sort of, you know, we've basically mistaken a very contingent syntax for a totalizing ontology in the current sort of LLM framework. I would be looking at what I'll call a plurality of approaches. Like LLMs are taking up all the heat, like world models are sort of following LLMs, but we're looking at a similar deep learning based, like bigger is better. We need all the surveillance data paradigm. I don't, one, I think that is just ultimately that narrative and the idea that scale at all costs is the best way to advance AI progress redounds to the benefit of the hyperscalers and those who already established their moat with the infrastructure, the compute resources, the data resources, the platforms for deployment, the cloud systems where they can license this, and the ability to sort of cross subsidize all of that. And so we need to be looking at, are there, non large scale approaches? Are there smaller, less dependent approaches, and that are, if we measure them in a way that is much more sensitive to the goal we want them to achieve in real life, are actually better than these large scale approaches? I mean, I could go on, but all of this needs real funding, and it doesn't just need funding, because what we don't need is, massive AI labs valued at trillions of dollars grading their own homework and deciding which research questions are interesting or not. We're going to get a very warped field. What we need are independent institutions that can actually ask and answer these questions in the public interest and can sort of develop an AI field that is less captured by industry, less captured by the need for industrial relationships, for compute, for data, for access to models, than the one that we've seen kind of cul-de-saced by industry over the last decade or so.
All right. Merci beaucoup.
That was my conversation with Meredith Whittaker. She's controversial, and I'm curious to hear what you think of her arguments. If you had to choose between the privacy of apps like Signal, the utility of AI, what would you pick? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to this channel for more.